Humane AI conversations from the Humane AI RPA at UVA. With these conversations, we tried to create an opportunity for meeting and engaging with researchers that have a passion around what we call humane AI or human-centric AI. These are not supposed to be long Zoom presentations. I think we all had enough of those, but conversations between people that you might have always wanted to chat to, or you might not even have known yet, and might want to experience new perspectives on humane AI. So we started with them last year during COVID. Our humane AI conversations were then very successful, and we continue this year with them, even though we can now meet again physically. I am Tobias Blanke, and I'm one of the PIs of the Humane AI RPA, and I'm just about to hand over to the two most important people in this conversation. But let me just in advance remind you that we have a website. On this website, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and you can also follow us on social media, of course. Please note that the webinar is recorded, and make sure that your microphones are on mute when you are not speaking. So we will have, after the initial chat, we will have ample time for you to ask your own questions, to discuss these topics of today further. So now I hand over to Hannah van Kolfschooten, who is from the Law Center of Life and Health at the UVA, and will guide us through today's conversation on developing AI for healthcare. And together with Hannah, we also have here Ivana Išgum, who is a university professor in health and AI, and a specialist on medical image. So over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Tobias. Yeah, first of all, I'm super happy to be here because, like you said, Ivana was actually on my list of persons that I've already wanted to talk to. So it's nice that we can do that here with an audience of people who are also interested in this. So I'm a PhD candidate in health law, and I focus on medical AI. And for me, that means both AI used in a healthcare setting and in a public health setting, like we see with the COVID crisis now. And today, Ivana Išgum will tell us a bit more about her work in the AMC and about developing AI for healthcare. And afterwards, we will engage in a conversation on the intersection of both of our research interests, so both healthcare law and development of the products. And I would like to give the floor to Ivana now.
Thank you, Hannah. Let me share my screen. You see my presentation? Yes, okay. So first, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. So as Tobias said, I'm University Professor AI and Medical Imaging, and I have appointments at the AMC, so Amsterdam University Medical Centers, at the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Physics, and at the Department of Radiology and Nuclear Medicine. And I also have an appointment at the Informatics Institute at the Faculty of Science. So together with Professor Clarissa Sanchez, we lead an interfaculty group on quantitative healthcare analysis, qurAI, we call our group. And our aim is to enhance patient care by designing novel AI technology. The group is embedded in the Faculty of Medicine, so at the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Physics, and at the Informatics Institute at the Faculty of Science. And with this interfaculty embedding, our aim is to bring fundamental AI research and development of AI towards clinical implementation and clinical applications closer together. And we also aim to strengthen and support research on AI for healthcare across the UVA, across the university. So we develop socially responsible AI solutions that have utilization potential. We perform research at the different aspects of patient care, primarily focusing on image analysis in prevention. Oh, I see something went wrong with my image, but with prevention, so we focus on screening, on prevention, diagnosis and treatment in various applications. Those are, for example, cardiovascular applications, eye diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, gastrointestinal diseases, and cancer. So we work on basically prevention, diagnosis, and treatment across various applications. And these applications, they're now at this moment but they can also be a bit dynamic, and they may change over time. So currently, we have healthcare system that is unsustainable. We have very rapidly increasing costs. We have aging population, which then requires healthcare more. And then rapid technology development leads to acquisition of more complex data and larger data sets, which needs more analysis. And here I primarily mean medical images, but it generalizes also to other data. And at the same time, we have increasingly shortage of experts, which results in overburdened system. And we have seen with this COVID crisis that some patients could not have access to care, while at the same time, healthcare professionals were overburdened and overworked. AI can potentially alleviate the problem, and we have seen in several publications already that AI performs better than experts in a number of applications. So here examples of detection of retinopathy, detection of skin cancer, or detection of prostate cancer. And as AI can outperform experts, or research shows that AI can outperform experts or enhance their performance in number of applications. At the same time, it is not really logical that AI is underutilized in healthcare compared to other fields. So if you look at publications that are published over the past years that are using machine learning or deep learning in healthcare, we see very steep increase in the number of papers. And most papers are published in pathology and radiology, and then other specialisms follow. And the differences are quite large, depending on the specialty. And we see that AI is mostly used in those that are utilizing medical images. But then we look at number of approved medical devices that are using AI in the US and in Europe since 2015, and we see that there is increase. So in 2015 there were about 10 systems approved, and in 2019 about 100. But we also see that this increase in number of devices or medical devices that are approved for use is not following the number of publications that are being produced. And a recent survey among radiologists in the US showed that even when AI software, so first we see that AI software is available, but it is not used. So it is surprising to see that almost 70% of radiologists report that they don't use AI. And even more surprising is that 80% say that they don't see the benefit. And then the reasons for this can be various, but one of them is probably performance. And recent studies show that software is not extensively evaluated. So this figure shows here that there are only 2 FDA-approved AI-based medical devices that were evaluated in multi-center and prospective studies. And there are also other studies that show that AI outperforms experts in limited settings, but apparently it doesn't really generalize. And if we want to have AI that can be widely used, evaluations are crucial. So this all shows that AI has some adoption challenges to overcome. There are primarily also regarding development, where the data availability still hampers research and the progress. And multidisciplinary collaborations are necessary more, I think, than it seems, because if you want to develop AI that can be used in clinic, expertise from various disciplines is desperately needed. Then there are also implementation challenges that are often of just really practical nature, like integration in clinical workflows, which is equally important. And then we have utilization questions that are primarily regarding trustworthiness. And they include robustness, resilience, and interpretability, which become important the moment the software is being used. So to shape our future in AI in healthcare, we need to form multidisciplinary teams, and we need to work in multidisciplinary teams. We still, I think, have to improve the way data is used and reused, but also software, not only the data. And we do have to co-create with the industry, because we researchers are designing, showing what is possible in some way, maybe prototyping, but then it is industry that will bring the technology where it is needed. So for these reasons, because UVA wants to be, of course, at the forefront, we have a program on AI for health decision making, where we look at so this AI for decision making is designed as inter-faculty collaboration between faculties of medicine, science, law, and humanities. And the aim is to develop AI considering all aspects of implementation, so we can develop socially responsible AI, what is called today. And here we focus on two applications, one in cardiology and one in intensive care. But the aim is to create an ecosystem and to show proof of principle, where we can then from this program extend further to different applications, but also to other disciplines, so that we can cover actually everything that is necessary, and also use the expertise we have at UVA. Maybe just to explain a bit closer what we actually want to do. So from the computer science, we want to look at trustworthiness. So the challenges, one challenge in using healthcare data is robustness, because data is not very well structured. It's often missing, it's often incomplete, and not because it is not maintained well or structured well, but because this is just reality, that not everybody has exactly the same pathway in data acquisition. And then we also want to look from the computer science perspective at determination of uncertainty and interpretability. The role of medicine is, of course, in all the development stages, but I would say that maybe the most important is to look at the outcome improvement and reduction of resources. So whether the AI that we developed can truly help. From the humanities perspective, I would say it is also looking at interpretability and transparency, but from the humanities side and not only from the computer science, like we at the computer science would do. And then, of course, the law is looking at autonomy of experts and understanding professional medical standards in these settings and in health decision making in general. And thank you for the attention. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting and really nice to see what you're doing and how it's so different from what we're doing here at the law faculty. So I think, yeah, that's why it's really good that we're starting this interdisciplinary project. Maybe as a first question, you just showed us how most research is on AI is on medical imaging. Why is that?
Yeah, so there are probably many reasons. So AI is much more than deep learning, and deep learning has boosted AI, and the medical images or images in general are very good data to research deep learning because of the way the patterns, the structure, the modalities, just really very good modality to investigate and to develop. But of course, AI is, as I say, in medicine, for example, now, machine learning is very much also utilized with other data that is less structured. Radiomics in radiology is very popular, not only radiology, but also using medical data. But the boost, when now people talk about AI, most of them mean deep learning, because deep learning has shown a real improvement in the performance compared to traditional methods.
Yes, yeah. And when a radiologist would be making use of this software, if it's developed, how would he or she see the difference?
The difference
well, I mean, a medical image analysis, of course, already being used by radiologists on a large scale. But then if we would bring in AI into the game, then how would the practice change for the radiologists using it?
Yeah, so I'm first not sure that it is that automatic image analysis is used on large scale. That is impression, I think, that generally people have impression that it is used very widely, but there is a lot of manual work still that is done. And then AI that would be accurate enough can help in two ways. One is in what is called assistive way, where it is automating process of an expert, and the expert is still in charge, and or automating it completely, where then the system would make the decisions instead of an expert. I think we are maybe still at a stage where automating routine tasks would help process, and it's still not widely implemented.
And do you also feel that maybe there's a little bit of a delay in implementation, like you also showed us that there is research, but not so much on the market yet in products, is because doctors don't really AI yet? So good.
No, I think if we would have, my personal opinion, if the evaluations would show that it really helps, that it reduces the workload, that it helps radiologists and also technicians in radiology in their daily work, I think it would be used, and that the trust would come with that. I think that mistrust is maybe also coming from the fact that it doesn't work yet the way they would maybe want to see it work. There is also not so much available on the market. So I've shown about 100 or a bit more than 100 products. It's relatively limited set. Yeah. And also, I guess integration is very important. How the software has to be integrated in clinical work. We shouldn't expect that experts are going to completely change their routine and for every piece of software go to another machine, or it's just not feasible. So integration, the way how the systems would be implemented is very important. Just from a very practical and maybe not super scientific process, but important to consider.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I read a research paper, I think it was 2 years ago, they did a survey on general trust in AI in society. And then out of that survey came that lots of people, well, it really depends on the sector it's used in, but they don't completely trust AI. And I think that healthcare was like on the top of the list of mistrust. Do you think that as an AI developer, you could help tackle that mistrust that people have?
So first, it is true. Research also shows that even in cases where AI outperforms expert or enhances their performance, they tend not to use it, even though they maybe have been trained within certain studies, and they don't trust it. The reasons can be various. One is probably performance level. I cannot imagine if an expert would see that it always works and agrees with their assessment, that they would not trust it. But we as experts, so we have to work on the evaluations, proper evaluations, large-scale evaluations, multi-center studies. Then we should also work on interpretability, because it is important maybe also in gaining trust. So the interpretability, what level of interpretability and what it really means in this context, we can discuss. I guess it's very, it's a complex question. And then robustness. So I think it is important that systems can detect when they cannot perform well, or maybe when the system is not certain that it can perform well. What happens, for example, at radiology, maybe you get a software update on a scanner and the characteristics of the data slightly changes. And maybe if I were an expert, I'm not always aware of all these things, and I'm not aware of settings in which the software can fail. And then maybe I cannot trust it either, because I don't know. Sometimes it works well, and maybe sometimes not. So we as researchers have to design mechanisms that allow that. And it's not really there yet. It is active area of research, but I don't think there are really solutions yet.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, because I'll take you a little bit to the law side of all of this, because I'm a legal scholar. So I work on at the moment at the EU regulation of artificial intelligence that proposed, and I'm especially looking into how they want to use this regulation to enhance trust. So the big regulatory goal of this regulation is enhance trust in those systems. Do you feel like having a regulation coming from the EU, could lead to more trust, or is it something that should really be in the product itself? And then I speak of also things with liability, maybe a little bit of rights for persons working with that AI, or is it really up to the product developers to gain that trust?
It is not only up to product development or product developers. I think we as scientists who are designing methods should do our part of the work to make sure that users can trust it. But it is, of course, also on the legal side. Who is liable, when is liable, and what moment may or maybe may expert overrule the decision of a system. There are many questions, I think, that we as developers on our own.
Also in terms of trust, you just said that you need the industry to get the products on the market, which makes sense, of course. But I also feel like many people wouldn't necessarily trust an AI product if they know that, for example, their data is being shared with those big commercial tech companies. So how do you see that, and how do you go about that kind of problem? Yeah.
So sharing data is an issue. We often hear that patients are sometimes even willing to share data for research, but they're not willing to share the same data with industry. Maybe being unaware that we researchers are in the end not going to be the ones bringing the product for their benefit. So it is necessary that industry can have access to the data if they want to develop, or if we want them to develop data-driven products. Data protection is, of course, very necessary, but there has to be a good balance between patient protection and progress in the society. And my impression is that we don't have this balance yet, because the current regulations, or maybe I would not even say regulation, but current practice hampers this progress. And then I think we, as researchers, scientists, have to work towards finding this balance that will not hamper progress, but will still benefit patients, because the progress will in the end be also for the patient benefit. And not, we shouldn't think about maybe what big or small companies want, but what we as a society want.
Yes, but yeah. And then are you talking with hampering innovation, also talking about data protection laws, maybe frustrating the process?
But it is hampering, right? So if I cannot share data, so if I develop some software that I can transfer to industry so they can develop it into product, if they don't have access to data I use, or actually much more data, it is hampering process. And they cannot have access to data because current practice in data protection may not allow it, or it makes it very complicated.
Yes, and on a how, maybe a more general question, how do you obtain this medical data at the moment that you need to develop AI?
Various ways, depending on the research question. So screening studies, clinical trials, public data sets, data from our hospital, asking colleagues from other hospitals to share data with you, a lot of personal contacts, rather than maybe very widely available structured systems where the data is being shared for research or development.
And how do you screen these data sets for accuracy or maybe bias? Because that's what we often read, right, in the newspapers, that one of the problems with AI and using it on a big scale is that the data being put in determines the outcome or the quality of the outcome. Yeah,
so one problem there is that we maybe necessarily have bias the moment we are limited to certain data set. If I'm limited to use data only from my hospital, this means that I will maybe have data at least from Dutch population, only Dutch population, and not even European or let's talk about international. And then data curation is a different question. Data curation is something that we all spend a lot of time on. It's not recognized as big thing, but I think that PhD students in my group spend, well, I will not say half, but third of their project towards, for example, one journal paper, curating data, cleaning it up, making sure that it is what it should be, annotating it.
And I read that in the beginning of the COVID pandemic last year in March, I read about some collaborations going on between European hospitals, especially about diagnosing COVID on medical images. Are you aware of any of those collaborations going on at EU level, and does that help?
Yeah, so I was one of them in one.
Oh, really? Oh, nice. I didn't know.
But it was a Dutch collaboration. So COVID showed that actually things can go fast. First, funding was available for COVID research on very short notice. So many people could work on COVID. Then data sharing was relaxed, or conditions were relaxed. So data sharing on short term was also possible, much faster and easier than it is otherwise. And industry was also aligned in this process. Everybody had interest to develop fast. And we see that products for detection were available very quickly. Also, regulations were much quicker than otherwise. So it shows that it can be done.
Would you also say that the pandemic maybe sped up like the process of actually using AI in hospitals? Or just this one COVID case?
I am a bit afraid that this is this one case. Maybe, of course, it helps in further thinking how things should be done, but it is not suddenly that everything goes as if it went in the COVID pandemic.
Okay. There's a rainstorm coming down at the moment. Not sure if you hear it too. Yeah, another question I had is maybe a bit more closely related to what I'm working on with patients' rights protection. So you already mentioned data protection, which is of course very relevant to patients' rights and privacy. That's also a big debate. But in a medical setting, there's also the requirement of informed consent. So if you're a doctor and you're treating a patient, you have to explain to him all the risks and the alternatives and ask for his consent. But then at the same time, we read all about the black box problem with AI, that maybe it's not even possible for doctors to really understand what the AI system is doing. So how can he then explain to patients what is about to happen? Do you take this into consideration when you develop, or is it still in such primary phases that you haven't really thought about this. So the problem of informed consent.
So we, of course, deal with it. So I have just what I have to do often in research. So I think about it. I'm not sure that informed consent requires explanation of how exactly the software that will be developed would work. That is also not possible because at the moment that I'm applying for informed consent, I don't know all the details. It's prior to research being done. From my experience, more of a problem is that I have to define exactly how I'm going to use the data. If there will be industrial partner, which industrial partner? What is the aim of this software? So I think that maybe gives enough information, and that all the details about the software and the inner working of the software are not necessary for patients. But what is the issue is that maybe now I ask for informed consent, and then 2 years later, I will have another project, and I will see that I could reuse this data. And that then becomes complicated, especially if another industrial partner is involved. There are exceptions when this can be arranged, but it is all quite not straightforward.
Yes, yeah. So that relates to the use of data and data protection laws again. Yeah, I see. And also because I understand that's probably not really relevant to the case of medical imaging, but probably at some point there will be doctors using AI like in their actual treatments. Mm-hmm. Is it then possible? Is it also something for developers to think about how informed consent mechanisms can be built into that system? And then in terms of treatments, informed consent.
Yes, but I'm not completely sure what should be built in. I think interpretability of a system is important in the sense that patients have rights to understand what happens to them and how the decision maybe about their condition or their treatment is being made. And that patients are not necessarily AI experts. So we have to design systems that can provide interpretability in way that is understandable to humans. It doesn't necessarily mean what we often now look at in computer vision, specific patterns where the activation is obtained, and that is maybe not really so important. I think where we have to go to is transforming this into comprehensible way. And then it is important that experts can communicate that to patients. In that sense, it is important. Whether informed consent is probably necessary in the sense that does patient agree that a software would be used and what this software does and how it performs, and maybe how much is expert in control of it.
Yeah, but you don't foresee that to be a big problem.
No, well, maybe it will turn out that it will be, but I don't think it is. The moment we will have mechanisms that we can explain, that we have interpretability that is comprehensible, I think it will be less of a problem that maybe we are now currently dealing with.
Okay. Yeah, my last question is more of a really broad overview. Let's look into the future question, I think. Because how would you see the AI hospital of the future? So let's say that you're a patient and you have real bad pains in your stomach, and you call your GP and he refers you to the hospital. Then what would happen in, let's say, 50 years if AI is really integrated in a hospital?
Yeah, so what we often hear this science fiction scenario where you come to hospital and you are greeted by a robot, and robot takes patient to a department where another robot maybe does the treatment or investigation. I don't think that will happen, and I personally hope that will not happen. What I hope is that we will have more humane care, and that experts will have more time to spend with patient, and that they will be supported by AI being assistive or autonomous, that will perform better than experts. Experts get tired. Some decisions are very, we know that there is large inter-observer agreement in many tasks. And I hope that AI will take that to some extent away. So I hope that we will have AI implemented on a wide scale at various stages of this patient pathway, but still there will be experts there to explain and spend time with patients.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I also hear a lot those science fiction stories about robots treating you and doctors being replaced, but you don't see it coming to that. That's good. I think we agree on that. Yeah, maybe I can open up the floor to other questions.
Thank you so much, Ivana and Hannah. Before we move on to that was really interesting. I really learned a lot today. So, but before we move on to the Q&A question, and I see we already have a question, and I can invite everyone, of course, to use the usual channels, which you are now used to by now, which is the chat box or the Q&A chat box to write down your questions for the panelists. But Hannah, I would also be really actually curious to know, how does the average day of a law researcher on house look like? Now that I have the chance to ask that somebody, and she, in your case, can't refuse me, so I'm gonna ask that question.
The average day.
So what do you research?
What do I research? Okay, so my PhD project is on patients' rights, and I look at that from an European perspective. So we see that we have all those member states who have their own national laws on medicine and how we should treat patients, but there's also like another level above it from the European Union and the fundamental rights instruments that we have. So that's where I'm coming from, that we have this shared interest in patients' rights in Europe. And then we also have the European Union, the European Commission, that really wants to regulate artificial intelligence and stimulate AI products on the market. So recently they proposed a regulation of AI to both provide more clarity on what kind of requirements there are for AI products to be placed on the market, and also protect fundamental rights while doing that. And actually I'm looking at how this more economic or market approach, how that matches with the more national patient right protection approach we have in Europe. So that's the broad idea of my project. And that means in a day-to-day research life, that means looking into case law that is coming from the Human Rights Court about patients' rights. And also at the national courts, how they refer to European rights that are made about patients. And really look at everything that's coming right now from the European Commission, because there's many initiatives, not only the pure legal regulation in the AI Act, but also a lot of collaboration. So I'm actually looking into, I just discovered that Ivana worked on a project, but on collaborations that on data sharing in Europe, how that relates to AI and regulation. And also the EU is starting a shared health data space. So they're really encouraging European member states to work together. And in the end, I want to see how all this EU action in the field of AI relates to patients' rights in the end. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Interesting. So one quick follow-up. So you mainly mentioned EU law. So Dutch law is not so important in this case, or do we all now look to Europe and wait for them to decide on AI regulation in health?
I think part
of just the focus of your thesis.
Yeah, so I focus on the EU, but it's also because part of the tech market is already regulated by the EU. So with these medical devices, that is now not so much AI, but will be in the future, that is already regulated by the EU because we have this open market and everybody needs to be able to sell their products, and you cannot really keep a product in one country because of the open borders. So that's why I'm looking from an EU perspective. But of course, all member states are all doing different things as well. But I think that's more from an ethical perspective within hospitals than an actual legal regulation perspective.
Interesting. So shall we move on to the Q&A then? I have a lot of questions, but let's maybe start with the audience. So Claire asked the question firstly. Thanks, Ivana, for the clear presentation. But the question is actually, can you speak to what role you think a patient user perspective should play in your research? So I guess it goes to the user perspective and maybe also to the evaluation that you mentioned and the changes in the evaluation.
Yes, so patients are very important. As I mentioned, we need this multidisciplinary collaboration, but patients also play a role in there. One is like expressing what they need and what they want to see. So for us, input for us as developers, but also in the evaluation and explainability. The moment we move to explainability, I think it is very important that patients say what they want to hear, how they want the information presented. Another question that is the discussion is if the AI is going to be used and it disagrees with expert. Should patient have rights to choose who do they want to decide? Or if research shows that AI outperforms experts, is it then ethical that expert overrules decision of an AI? So their patients can also play a role in saying what they want, and maybe on a group level as a representative of patient, but also maybe on an individual level.
Interesting. So from what I hear now, it's a little bit maybe that you expect explainability to also become much more kind of human-computer interaction research challenge. Is that correct? Rather than, I think it's very much held at the moment on the very epistemological level of what is explainability. Would you think that is the next move in this world? Or?
Well, we do, for example, I mean, explainability can be investigated in computer science in various ways. One of them is searching for prototype information. And I think that maybe comes the closest to what is explainable. I mean, of course, the current methods that show where in the image activation was obtained, if it points on pathology, it tells something, although we don't know how exactly this information was used. But maybe it is better if we can show similar patients or similar examples or opposite examples and then explain that way. I suppose that is a bit also how physicians would explain to patients what normally happens when they see something and why do they.
And Hannah, do you get involved in this kind of, concrete implementation of how to explain systems to patients, also from a law perspective? Is this also part of, maybe not you personally, but your colleagues? Or? You're currently muted, Hannah. No worries. This is a Zoom age.
Zoom. I am looking into informed consent, so that's one of the patient's rights that I'm doing research into. But at the moment, my project is really theoretical. But I hope to engage in the projects that are starting. I don't know when they're starting, but they're part of the project, the RPA project Ivana just told us about. So I hope to see in practice then what happens with like the doctor-patient relationship and a patient's right to informed consent when it's implemented in practice in cardiology, especially. Because we already briefly discussed it before, because it really depends on your interpretation of informed consent as well. Like, is it really necessary for a patient to know everything about the system to make an informed decision? Probably not. But maybe you will have to provide patients with a choice whether they want to be treated by, if it comes to that, some kind of AI medical device or by a human. So yeah, I'm looking into that problems, but at the moment just theoretical, and at a later stage, hopefully in practice in the AMC.
And I'm already looking forward to working on that RPA then. It sounds very exciting. So we have also, because humanities includes also logic, as does of course science. So we also have our in-house logician, if I may call Ansi like this, and she asked about the question towards deep learning techniques towards AI medical applications. It seems, at least intuitively, the studies on causal reasoning should also pertain to the use of AI in medicine. I guess this goes to you, Ivana. How do you see the role of causal inference in addressing the challenges you mentioned in the talk?
Yeah, so causality is very important. And it is also being investigated in medical imaging, and I think in other healthcare applications using AI. I don't know what more to say about it, except that I actually expect that moving towards utilization and moving towards wider spread use, this will become more important than it is now.
So, and I just subsumed causality to logic. That's probably also not right. No, I guess there's also some, I see now kind of this appearing now, for instance, I give a lecture in the introduction to the BSc course of AI the first year, so on big data and ethical challenges. And I saw there's now a causality talk too, as introducing students. So this is also now a big topic in the kind of, let's say, machine learning kind of computational, yeah?
Yes. It is becoming more and more research and investigated, yeah.
Okay, Chris, do you want to type your question into the chat, or do you want to ask it directly? I don't really mind. Don't be shy. You can ask.
I just wanted to know how it's usually done in these conversations, as I've never been here before. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the reasons why do you think experts lack AI adoption? Is it just because they don't trust the technology, or might they also feel maybe replaced by the abilities that AI systems might have? So, because like diagnosis was always a domain of physicians, and maybe all of a sudden they feel also a bit threatened and replaced by AI systems. I was wondering whether these very psychological reasons might also play a role in this.
Yeah, they probably do, although I think we are somewhat past their top. At the beginning, everybody was really afraid that suddenly we don't have to train radiologists, computers will take over, and many people will be out of job. I think now understanding is that this is not going to be the case. I really hope that AI will, to some extent, replace experts on short term, on repetitive tasks that are not necessarily difficult, and that where we have technology to replace experts. And that would ease the system, that people would be less overburdened. But we also, I think, now all agree that there will be tasks where expert is necessary. And that AI will support in this decision making. And there, I think we are maybe with technology not there yet. And the reasons are also that we don't evaluate or don't have true possibilities to evaluate the systems and train. Typically, research study, I can talk about mine. I think it is very typical. We want to do a project. We collect data set from a location, typically my hospital or multi-center study, but multi-center study then still limited. And especially for data that is collected in some studies for certain purpose is typically nice. And when we would apply this in a real in real situation, there will be data that is not so nice, that has artifacts, that has severe artifacts, that there are patients with a different pathology than we have seen in our study. And the moment the systems don't work there, experts cannot rely on them. So it goes back to a bit what I have said. We need to have this resilience. We need to have robustness. And we have to show and demonstrate on large-scale studies with large variability in the data that systems work, and that maybe they know when they don't work.
Great. I now have also the opportunity to, we are almost at the end of the time, so I'm just going to use the chance now to ask my questions because I can. So Ivana, I actually always wanted to say, because you mentioned, of course, that deep learning has basically changed everything in many ways because of the capacities to analyze images. Is there a kind of ImageNet moment in kind of, because deep learning on the one hand side is the mechanism, but would have, at least in the word that I can judge, it's not been possible without this kind of large-scale collaboration on creating a joint databases of images, which is called ImageNet. So was that also a moment in kind of medical AI imaging? And maybe the second question is, because we talk a lot about where I think we map our experience with AI system from the kind of world we know better, let's say Facebook, Google, etc., towards medical imaging. Do you reuse the kind of pre-trained algorithm from these kind of words? So does it actually apply what we say about this to this medical imaging, or are your algorithms all solely trained on medical data? We need to be a bit more careful to make these assumptions.
Okay, so what we see is the computer vision is it is further than medical image analysis. And I think it is further primarily because there is so much data available. Mm-hmm. Only these methods that are developed for computer vision that analyze small and two-dimensional images typically do not generalize to large medical images that have 3, 4, 5 dimensions, much larger volumes, and different characteristics of the data. So I have seen many students implementing something that has been published in computer vision, adjusting it somewhat to medical images, and this somewhat adjusting typically fails. So we do have to do development there. We can, of course, look at the novel technology that is developed in computer vision, and that's what we also do, and try to learn from that. Medical data is specific, and it requires, I think, just to summarizing, it requires dedicated development. Pre-trained models depends on application. In some applications, if the model is pre-trained on ImageNet data, for example, it may help. In other applications, I've seen when it doesn't help, and it's better to train from scratch. We also see that we don't need, in medical imaging, depending on the task, but we don't always need these huge data sets. It's more about representative data in your set. That should resemble what will be resembled in practice. But some tasks, like segmentation tasks, which are not super challenging, they can be achieved with a relatively small amount of images or training images. And that was one question. What was the other? I forgot a little bit.
So I think in a way you answered them both. The other was whether there was an ImageNet moment where the community came together and created this, because we talked a bit earlier about joint databases.
Yeah, it would be nice to have ImageNet for healthcare, but I think it's much more complex than with natural images.
And then I have one final quick question. So because we briefly touched upon it, so what do you think about how useful has AI shown to be in the COVID pandemic? So say there's a big debate, of course, to say, and has a lot to do with medical imaging, from what I understand from the debate. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think it was very useful. It sped up things. What I mentioned already, the fact that funding was available, many people worked on the same questions, data was available, industry was aligned, and technology was available. So we could maybe base it on existing methods and tune them further, develop them for the problem at hand. And it has shown that it is possible to develop something very fast. So it would be probably possible for other applications as well.
And people were happy with the result, with the contribution of AI to the COVID, to solving the COVID. I don't really know what to say.
That is a bit difficult question, because I think at the moment that where most images had to be analyzed and where it was not completely clear what is important in this data, software was not there yet, and the software is there now, but the pressure is not so high. But of course, the software remains, and the COVID will probably not go away, and there will still be quantification necessary from the medical images, and it should support experts in the analysis.
Thank you so much. I think we are now at the end, unless there's somebody having one final question for Humane AI conversation. And I couldn't be happier with how this began in this year. So it was very fascinating. I learned a lot, both from Ivana, of course, but also from Hannah. I never knew how exciting law research about medical imaging and AI can be. Otherwise, I want to all remind you that on our website, you can find the details of our next Humane AI calls, and please do subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. And then finally, it's just one virtual clap for Ivana and Hannah, that we are very grateful that you could be here today. And I look forward to the collaboration in the Health AI Decision-Making RPA. I think I got